Good afternoon, everyone. This is episode number 35 of Mini Ice Age Conversations. Today is September 23rd, 2017. I'm your host, David Dilley, creator of the Adapt 2030 Mini Ice Age 2015 to 2035 series on YouTube. Today, I have with me David Dilley, President and Chief Research Scientist of Global Weather Oscillations, Inc. You can find more information about what we're talking about with different slides, forecasts at globalweathercycles.com. Now, David also talks about hurricane predictions 4 years into the future, Earth, Moon, Sun alignments, and these are the things that we wanted to cover today, as well as warm water pulses into the Arctic that cause more sea ice or less sea ice, and overall longer-term cycles beyond the decadal cycles into the multi-century cycles that we're repeating as we speak, so we can get a good gauge looking into the future what our global weather patterns will be like based on past cycles that do repeat. So David, I really thank you for joining me today. I know we're going to have a great conversation. 18-year cycle. I think this is a great place to start.
Yes, David, it certainly is. The Earth-Moon-Sun interactions are really a overlooked field. Everyone's honing in on the sun. And what I've found in my research during the past 20, 25, 30 years, it's really the interactions of the Earth-Moon-Sun, gravitational cycles of them. And these actually line up pretty good with the solar cycles also. But there are so many Earth-Moon-Sun-Lunar gravitational cycle patterns that this should really be looked at because we have many cycles. Now, basically, one thing that happens is the sun, of course, with the tilt of the Earth from season to season, the sun goes from, in respect to the equator, minus 23.5 degrees, I think it is, south of the equator. That is their summer. Then during the northern hemisphere summer, it comes to plus 23.5 degrees of latitude. So that's down 23.5 and up 23.5. Now, the moon has a different cycle. It also, in relationship to the Earth's seasonal tilts, and the moon has its own monthly cycles, and seasonal and yearly cycles. The moon, over the long-term period, 18 years, was a very famous 18 to 18.5-year cycle, will start at the beginning of the cycle. The moon, instead of 23.5 degrees up and down on the sun, the moon will change from, over a long-term pattern here, to as much as 29 degrees above or below the equator, and to as little as 17 to 18 degrees above or below the equator. That's quite different than the sun. And then when they kind of meet up in alignment, then you get your syzygies, very strong gravitational cycles that we'll talk about later. But when you do get a syzygy in alignment, the actual gravitational tug on the Earth can increase by as much as 47% above normal gravitational cycles. That's why in some coastal areas, you will get coastal flooding, ocean flooding, low-lying coastal flooding during very specific strong new moons or high moons. The new moon is just as strong as the full moon. A lot of people don't understand that. But the new moon you have to look at in the cycles also. So let's get back to the cycles in the moon. There's an 18 to 18.5-year cycle. And we'll start at the beginning. Let's say it's up there at 28, 29 degrees in the sky. This is looking at very strong cycles very strong gravitational cycles where the Earth, Moon, Sun are closely aligned, and or the proximity to Earth will increase the gravitational cycles. So here we are, day one. It's 28, 29 degrees in the northern hemisphere. 4 years later, it'll be down in the southern hemisphere, 4-year pattern. Down in the southern hemisphere at maybe 26 degrees of latitude. 4 years later, it'll be back to the northern hemisphere. That's a 9-year cycle, going back to the northern hemisphere. It takes 9 years to go from the northern hemisphere to the southern hemisphere, back to the northern hemisphere. Now, that very big peak that we talked about diminishes every 9 years. Halfway through the pattern, the elevation in the sky will be closer to 17, 18 degrees of elevation above the equator. Then finally, once it finishes the whole 18.5-year period, it'll be back high in the sky again at about 28, 29 degrees. So we're seeing in this little pattern here, we're seeing 4-year cycles, 9-year cycles, and 18-year cycles. The same cycle, if you stretch it out in time, actually goes out to longer cycles. Same type of thing where it goes higher in the sky to lower in the sky. You can stretch it out to 72-year cycles, out to even longer periods of cycles. And actually, the Earth's temperatures during the last, let's say 600,000 years, the temperature plot where we have our global warming cycle, interglacial period, every 120,000 years or so, we had a high peak in it way back 600,000 years ago and a higher peak this time. The pattern looks just like this 18.5-year lunar cycle. So what it is just a stretched out pattern of the 18-year lunar cycle.
So it's sort of a fractal of itself going up exponentially large or coming down exponentially small.
That's right.
Okay. What I would ask then is, when do these all lock in sync? Well, you're talking about at the high point, if you will, the peak at, say, 29 in the northern hemisphere. When does that lock with solar max? Or when does it, in the inverse, when the trough, if it's down southern hemisphere 26 degrees and it's at a solar min, when do those two lock? And how often do they lock together at both peaks exactly happening at the same time? And that would be either on the 9 to 18, the 72, or going out into longer cycles. At what point do these lock where you can start to see a relationship between the solar maximums and the locking of the upper peaks in these lunar cycles?
Well, actually, these cycles gravitationally lock in on fall equinox, fall, spring, winter, and summer. You get your stronger patterns. That's where the Earth, Moon, Sun become closer in proximity to each other. That's because the Sun is crossing the equator, and the Moon has a better chance of becoming in proximity to the Sun, the elevation of the Sun. And what happens is you'll have this proximity. That's, I just talked about 4 times a year. You'll have pretty good proximity and stronger gravitational cycles. But what happens in the longer-term cycle is you get into years where instead of happening maybe, like I said, on each spring, winter, summer, fall, that's 4 times a year, it'll stretch out where that cycle may go about 3 months in a row or 4 months in a row. And if during the course of the year, instead of this occurring 4 months, it may occur almost 8 months out of a year, this proximity where we have stronger gravitational pull. And this is where you come into play where you get stronger cycles in this. And this is actually what I've plotted on this graphic that you're looking at is the stronger cycles where it does come into play. It's coming into play pretty much on the whole pattern that I showed there during the 18.5-year pattern. But a lot of things occur on certain parts of the cycles. That's the thing. Certain climate features occur on certain patterns of it because of your latitude or longitude around the Earth. You get the changes in your climate cycles.
Would you expect more tectonic and volcanic activity to be induced by these higher and more strong gravitational cycles? And can you peg that to any eruptions or earthquakes that have been measured over time to these plots that you're talking about and have mapped out already?
Oh, definitely. I've done a research on the California earthquakes. The reason I did California is there's a very good historical record going back 200 years. So what I did, I looked at one of my models, specific models, and I could track. And what I did, I plotted the earthquakes, the only ones that were 6.0 or greater earthquakes. So I was looking at the stronger earthquakes. And I saw definite cycles in there, on the gravitational cycles. And I could actually track a earthquake cycle up through time, where this cycle has maybe occurred 3 or 4 times during the past 200 years, you can track it right up through time. And because of that, I have a forecast on the website available for the next big California earthquake. There are two strong cycles coming up in the 2020s. And one of them will be in Southern California, one in Northern California. And the reason I could say which Northern or Southern is because I tracked them up through, there are two different cycles I'm tracking. And one of the cycles for Southern California and one of the cycles is for Northern California. But the interesting thing about it is when the earthquakes occur in California, everyone would think, okay, it's going to occur on the peak gravitational cycle, correct? Because you have the greatest gravitational pull. Well, what I've noticed is, and we have to look at is, on real strong gravitational cycles, the tug on the Earth can increase by as much as 47%, which is a great increase in the gravitational tug on the Earth. Now, the inner core of the Earth is essentially molten hot metallic metal. Well, that great tug can actually make a bulge in the inner core by about 1.5 kilometers. Now, that's a pretty good-sized bulge, because up above the inner core, you go up a ways, and you have the plates. And the plates move a little bit, so if you have a bulge below the plates are going to have to bulge a little bit. And then when the bulge goes away, you'd expect, okay, the plates will relax. And what I noticed is the big earthquakes don't come on the greatest gravitational part of the cycle. It comes after the cycle has relaxed, which means the plates are relaxing, and then they slip, and you get an earthquake.
And I noticed that also. I was looking at the Lunisolar gravitational tidal forcing chart on the 9-year cycle, and what caught my attention right there was 1991 with the Pinatubo eruption, and it falls exactly where you're talking about on the backside of the peak by about 1 year after that great gravitational pull. Coming down off that peak, it looks like it loosened up and then let go. And then also, if we're going to look down at Mount St. Helens, it came at the trough there.
That very well could be. And actually, some of these cycles that are plotted, you're looking at my cycle here, you could do other gravitational plots using a little bit different power structures on how high the moon is in the sky in relationship to proximity to the sun and the proximity to Earth. You can do it differently, and you'll get a power structure here that's about 1 year different. And a lot of people use the one that's 1 year different. Mine is off by 1 year, kind of backed up 1 year from most of the cycles that are out there. But yes, that's what would probably occur, like you said. It's lining up on there because that's the great tug on the inner core of the Earth. And one thing, and as long as we're talking about this now, let's jump to where I talk about we've had 5 global warming cycles, actually 6 during the past 1,200 years. We have come off onto 5 global cooling cycles. What I have noticed on the global cooling cycles is once you get about 15 to 25 years into the global cooling cycle, you have a great VMI 5 or 6 volcano, such as Tambora in 1815. And what did Tambora do? Year of no summer in 1816. It really disrupted the climate around the world in the northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere. Now, it makes sense that, yes, you would have increased really dramatic volcanic activity because of this great gravitational tug on the Earth being relaxed or increased. So what I noticed is on the 5 global cooling cycles, 4 out of the 5 had these big, huge volcanoes. And it's sort of a double whammy. You're going into real great global cooling, but then you get a huge volcano on top of it. And that even drives the stake further where it gets even colder, like in 1816. And that's kind of what we're looking at down the road. We're slipping into global cooling now. We can talk about it later. I say it actually began about 4 years ago, but it's going to come in earnest in about 2 years. So what we're looking at is Okay, maybe 15 years after that or so, or it could even be 10 years after that. We could very well have a year of no summer again here on Earth, and that could cause a huge disruption.
When we talk about moving forward into the cooling climate, beyond what it would do for disruption in just regular transportation systems or the economy of a regional area, you have to take a look back at some of these larger eruptions, and they did absolutely wipe out cultures. If we go back into the late antique Little Ice Age, the volcanic eruptions at that time were so large, even though they happened in Asia, that it affected South America, Central America, specifically the Mayan culture they were studying at that time, why they suddenly had a drop-off. But it was a full northern hemispheric episode again. So it could be just a single volcano that goes off that could have that much disruption in our modern agriculture systems. And with the just-in-time delivery systems that we have going on, that could spell disaster for people who need food delivered to a supermarket that comes every 2 or 3 days. Well, what happens if you don't grow food for an entire season? How much is really in the silos that can be pulled out? And then what kind of pricing push would that have if everybody really understands that this year there's none, zero coming out? And then next year will be less, obviously, because it just doesn't go from zero or from 100 to 0 and then back up to 100 again in the next year. It's going to be a gradual build-up back from that point. So it could take 2-3 years to get back to the point of full agricultural productivity that we have. You know, going into these volcanic eruptions, it's a game changer. It's a kind of a wild card, as I call it, in this cooling cycle that we can expect.
Well, that's for sure, and that's why I keep telling people that global cooling is much, much more dangerous than global warming ever would be. Global warming you can adapt to, actually increases your crop range in a lot of areas. Global cooling, though, shrinks your crop range, and you could have huge crop failures in some of the agricultural belts. And all you need is a crop failure for 1 year. And in 1815, when Tambora erupted during the global cooling cycle, Tambora is actually in the southern hemisphere. So people would say, well, we're okay up here in the northern hemisphere. Well, it greatly affected the northern hemisphere. They had yellow snow in parts of Europe, potato famine, crop failure 5, 10, 15 years following Tambora. Almost 1/3 of Europe perished because of famine and disease and civil unrest. Back then, we only had 1 billion people to feed here on Earth, and now we have 7 billion people to feed. If we have a crop disruption, we're going to have major civil unrest.
Yeah, that's to go without saying. That's a whole other contentious issue people talk about and say, no, it wouldn't happen because we can grow enough food in our own country. Well, if you're not growing food, well, it doesn't matter if it's in your own country or you import it. You're all in the same basket, in the same boat together. That's why I talk about people needing to mitigate or at least learn how to, bring some of the agriculture indoors and learn how to grow some plants inside using different types of lighting systems. Electricity will still be up and running. And I talk about utilizing caves and growing mushrooms and greenhouses and things to protect your crops, because if you literally had those inside a greenhouse protected environment, you could still grow some. And this would be extremely localized in neighborhoods or just local areas. But at that point, you're going to have to be taking care of yourself anyway, and the self-sufficiency, and I always talk about that so heavily, is these things are coming. It's not if it's going, it's now we're mapping it out as to which years it's going to happen. So you better be preparing in many ways other than just, keep going to work every day and pretend like it's not going to happen. Hey, my retirement will be here in 35, 50 years. No problem. I can use my retirement money to buy food. No, I don't think that's going to happen.
Well, that's for sure, because there's really two reasons we have to look at being prepared. One is just the climate. If we do have this year of no summer somewhere down the road, like I said, maybe 15 years from now, 25 years from now, or what happens if it's only 8 years from now, and we're not prepared and have enough food stored up. Most people in the big cities only have about 2 days of food in their refrigerator, and that's it. They're done. They don't have any more food. But the good thing is we could grow food in the warmer climates to supply the rest of the world. But, of course, it takes time to plant additional crops. Meanwhile, you're going to have a shortage of food. And because of shortage of food, you're going to have one country trying to get food from another country. And this can happen either through the climate situation here or through the situation that everyone's talking about, where the next big threat could even be the electromagnetic bomb that some countries may be looking at as a threat around the world. So there's two major things that could affect our food supply down the road, and we should be prepared. Even the Bible talks about saving your food crops, having a 7-year supply of food to get you through periods of drought. And we don't do that. We do not do that. We go from day to day or week to week.
Yeah, and going back as well, that old phrase, the meek shall inherit the earth. And this is where you come right back into talking about tropical growing belts, because predominantly across the equatorial regions or these really close to the equator countries, most of them are impoverished and not developed economies. And when you talk about the meek, literally in economic terms, that's where all the food growing would be, and they would be the strong powerhouses and the bread baskets of the world, where up in the north, where we traditionally have more developed economies, they would be the ones that would not be able to grow food, relying on, and not, whoever has the food at that point controls society pretty much. Because I think the food would even be more valuable than money and more valuable than energy at that point. I really firmly believe that food will be the most valuable commodity on our planet when it comes to that.
Oh, that's for sure. And look what happened to Ireland and parts of Europe after Tambora in 1815 and the Year of No Summer in 1816. People started to migrate out of Europe, the ones that did not get sick and frail and perish. A lot of them migrated to the United States and other areas, and that's what we'd see worldwide. But, this is things that's going to come down the road, and what we have to look at is, okay, what really causes climate change in the first place? We have one segment of the society here saying, well, man is causing climate change. We've never been this warm before, and carbon dioxide has never been this warm before, and this is all false. One thing we want to look at is global warming and global cooling ends and begins in the Arctic and the Antarctic.
So one thing I did want to touch on was the meltwater pulses, the pulses into the Arctic that you also have mapped out here on the cycles, when it seems to be very correlated to the amount of Arctic sea ice cover and the temperature of the water and the pulse going up into the Arctic. And you even have a chart for this right here. That's
right. This was an article that I read in volume number 92, number 5, May 2011, in the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society. What they saw was they mapped out 3 warm pulses of North Atlantic water that were pulsing into the Arctic. And what caught my attention on the article was the first warm water pulse was in 1990. What they said, it goes into the Arctic, takes it 13 years to circulate around the Arctic. It goes up through the Ural Straits between Greenland and Ireland, that area, up into the Arctic Ocean. So it's called a warm water pulse to the North Atlantic. Well, in 1990, there's a warm pulse. Then in 1999, 9 years later, there was a very warm pulse into the Arctic. Then 9 years later, in 2008, another warm pulse, but not quite as warm. So the first one in 1990 was warm, and 2008 were warm, but the real warm one was in 1999. So what happens is when you get warm water pulsed up into the Arctic ice doesn't melt from the top down. The ice is submerged. There's no land in the Arctic. All the ice is really submerged by 75, 80%. The ice melts from the bottom up because of the warmer water. And when you have the ice melting, then you have more open water during the summer months in the Arctic. And then it takes longer for it to freeze up and get extent in the winter. So if you have less extent of ice, you have less cold air available in the Arctic. Once it starts freezing up again, like it did in 2013 and 14 winters where the Arctic was recovering, we had much more cold air available and it came southward. And this is again happening this year where we've gone past the El Niño and the Arctic water is cooling down again and we're going to have another big ice extent. But back to the warm water pulses. I mentioned three of them, 1990, 1999, and 2008. That caught my eye. Gee, they're 9 years apart. I put them onto my graphic, and what I saw was the pulse in 1990 came right at the peak of the Earth-Moon-Sun gravitational cycle, where the gravitational cycle, it was a high one, about 26 degrees above the equator. It's a northern hemisphere cycle. So that was in 1990. Well, 9 years later, wow, there it was, back to the northern hemisphere, high in the sky again, the gravitational cycle. Not quite as high, but it was about 22 degrees above the equator. And there it was again, 1999, 9 years later, a very warm pulse in the Arctic. That's what caused the very warm next 12 years, that very warm pulse. Then 9 years later, right on top of the gravitational cycle, and the gravitational cycle of the moon was about 26, 27 degrees above the equator. In 2008, they said there's another pulse coming into the Arctic, not as warm. So it takes that 13 years to cool down to completely go away. Well, what's 13 years from 2008? That's 2021, the year 2021. I keep talking about the year 2019 to 2020. That's when the real global cooling is going to be coming, because that warm water pulse is going to be gone and the Arctic's going to freeze up like a solid rock.
With that as well, then these could be longer duration cycles that would be more powerful, that would push more water or make the water cooler themselves. Because I see the same things overlapping with these fractals of cycles. So if they can be mapped out into 200-plus year cycles, could there be a 200-plus years warm water or cool water pulse cycle that goes in that's actually overriding or even more powerful of a cycle that overlays on top of these smaller cycles?
Well, as it relaxes, of course, then the water gets cut off, the warm water gets cut off. If you're not getting a pulse up into the Arctic on the next 9-year cycle, which would be in 2017 this year, if that's not a very warm pulse, if it's just a pulse, then the Arctic's not going to warm up at all, and that's going to allow it to really start freezing up solid. And I've noticed during the past, since May, the high Arctic temperatures are running below normal. I saw this also back in the winters of 2013-14, same thing, running below normal from May until this period. And those two winters were cold. They were cold winters. Now, the prior time you had the cold air like that, where it ran below normal for such a long period during the summer, allowing big freeze up, you had to go back in the 1970s to 1960s. So we're starting to get back into the cycles of the 1960s and 70s. This is why I'm saying global cooling actually began about 4 years ago in 2013. It just got disrupted by the very strong El Niño in 2015. That's all. That was just a temporary stop. And now we're going to start going into the real global cooling right around 2019, 2020, as the Arctic starts to really freeze up. Now, you wanted to talk a little bit about a longer cycle. I talked about this very warm pulse 9-year cycle in 1999. What I have found is, okay, we're talking about 9-year pulses, and we've talked about 18-year cycles, 18 years and 9 years and 4 years. There's a 72-year cycle. It looks very similar to the 18-year cycle, but there's a 72-year cycle. What's 72 years from 1999? 1927. It is highly likely that we had a very warm water pulse go into the Arctic right around 1927, 1928. The whole decade in the 1930s was very warm.
Yeah, Dust Bowl. That was the Dust Bowl era.
Oh, yeah, that's very warm. All global warming cycles have twin temperature peaks that last 10 to 15 years. 1930s, and for us, from about the year 2000 to 2012, 2013 or so. These are all natural cycles. We're right on the cycle and the pattern that we're supposed to be on. So back to the 72-year cycle. Okay, I just pointed out 1927. That was a very likely warm water pulse on that 72-year cycle. So we've seen this twice here, right? Now, what I've done on my long-term averaging of the Earth, Moon, Sun strength of the gravitational cycles, okay, on the 72-year pulse, I put it out in time, and what happens is when you have the 72-year pulse, you get the new moon and full moon on the long-term average kind of being on the same plane elevation-wise in the sky. Well, what happens on the long-term cycles, okay, this happened in 1999. It happened in 1927. Then when you go back prior to that, and the way the cycle is formed, it skipped that next 72-year cycle. Then it came in again on the next one. This is why we have global warming cycles that come every 230 years, based on the 72-year cycle that skips a cycle.
So you can plot us out exactly where we are now and where we're heading to into the future then based on prior cycles. And if we go back a step even further, let's take a further step back from the 230-year cycle, where does that take us? 1,100 years? And then from there, if we take a step back off 1,100 years, how far back are we going? Because I noticed you had a chart here on the 1,100-year cycle that also encompasses and overlays all of these smaller cycles on top as well, encompassed in there as a matrix of smaller leading to larger that entwine into one larger cycle that all overlay in the same time frames.
This is a extremely interesting cycle. So what happened was back, right now, we're in a warm period. Then we cooled down in the mid-1800s. Well, we go back 1,100 years, and that's about 900 AD. That was a peak of a very warm cycle. Go back another 1,100 years, and that was a peak of another very warm cycle. We go back another 1,100 years and another 1,100 years, so on and so on. So we go back to about 6,600 years ago. That was when we came off the prior glacial period, about 7,000 years ago. We were very warm back, much warmer than today, a very long, extended warm period going about 2,000 years, very extended warm period. Much warmer than today. There are reports there's 50% less ice in the Arctic at that time than today. And we have all these people out there saying, oh, this has never happened before. We don't have any ice up there in the Arctic today, and it's all going to be gone in a few years. Well, it was worse 7,000 years ago. And these cycles, as we were saying on the graphic, is extremely warm 7,000 years ago. Then if we look at the 1,100-year cycles coming to today, each cycle is getting cooler and cooler and cooler. What we have to remember is we're 7,000 years removed already from the peak of the interglacial warm period. We're 7,000 years heading towards the next ice age. We're cooling down gradually here. And what we have today is not as warm as it was even 1,000 years ago. What we have are temperatures right now on the twin warm peaks of 1930s and now, perfectly normal. Perfectly normal for this type of cycle. There's no doubt about it. And as we slip into the global cooling cycle here, very shortly I talked about that cycle. And actually, if we skip to that other graphic that I have, the 230-year cycle, on the average, global cooling cycles come, or global warming cycles, either way, come every about 230 years. It can be as short as 200 years or as long as 240 years between cycles. We had a global warming cycle back in the 800s AD. Now the global